My name is Catherine Holloway, and the day my parents called to ask me to fund their retirement, I had exactly one question. Not how much, not when do you need it, not even why are you asking me. My question was, do they actually think I'm going to say yes? Because here's what they seem to have forgotten. 7 years earlier, they had sat me down at the dining room table, the one with the good chairs, the ones that only came out for serious conversations and the kind of confrontations that are dressed up as serious conversations, and told me that if I married Alan, they would cut me out of their lives completely. The will, the holidays, the Sunday dinners and the birthday calls, and the version of my future they had been designing in their heads since I was old enough to have a future worth designing. Everything. I married Alan anyway. So when my mother's name appeared on my phone on a Thursday afternoon in March, 7 years later, I almost didn't answer. I stood in my kitchen and watched her name light up my screen for the full 4 rings before I picked up. I don't know exactly what made me answer. Curiosity, maybe. Or the particular kind of pull that family has on you even after years. Even after everything, that gravity that doesn't entirely go away no matter how much distance you put between yourself and it, I answered. My mother said, "We've been thinking about you. We'd love to reconnect." She used the word reconnect. 7 years. And she used the word reconnect like we had simply drifted apart the way friends do, like no one had said anything at any dining room table with any good chairs. I said I would think about it. What I actually thought about was what my aunt had told me. What I found when I started looking, what was really underneath that phone call. That's what this story is actually about. But I need to take you back first, because none of what happened makes sense without understanding where it started. Alan and I met at a hardware store. I know, not the beginning my mother had scripted for me. She'd had a different opening scene in mind since I was about 14, something that took place at a charity gala or a dinner party hosted by someone whose name she recognized, or possibly a law firm holiday reception where everyone had gone to the right schools and knew which fork was for salad. She had written and rewritten that story for years. She was very committed to it. The hardware store version was not going to satisfy her. I was 26 years old. I had just moved into my first apartment, a 1-bedroom with good light and a north-facing wall that I had decided, with the misplaced confidence of someone who has watched too many home improvement videos, was going to be an accent wall. I was standing in the paint aisle holding 2 swatches and feeling increasingly certain that Coastal Mist and Quiet Harbor were, in fact, the same color with different names, when someone to my left said, "Quiet Harbor. The undertone is warmer, better for north-facing rooms." I turned around. Alan Mercer was 30 years old. He had a smear of paint on his left forearm from a job he'd finished that morning, and he was buying supplies for the one he was starting that afternoon. And he said it the way people say things when they actually know what they're talking about, not performing expertise, not trying to impress anyone, just answering the question I hadn't technically asked, because he noticed someone standing there genuinely confused and it didn't occur to him not to help. We stood in that paint aisle for 20 minutes. He explained the difference between eggshell and satin. He told me that north-facing rooms shift all afternoon as the light changes and you want something with warmth built into it or the wall will look cold by 3 p.m. He helped me find the right primer. He showed me the brush I actually needed as opposed to the one I'd picked up because the packaging looked professional. Before he left, he said, "Let me know how the wall turns out." I said, "I don't have your number." He smiled. That was the first time I saw him smile. He has this smile that starts slow and takes over his whole face, and I noticed it immediately and filed it somewhere important. He gave me his number. He texted me that evening to ask how the painting was going. I told him I hadn't started yet. He offered to help on Saturday. I said yes. That was the entire beginning. Paint aisle, primer, Saturday. I need you to understand who Alan is, because my parents' version of him is not the real version, and this story requires you to know the real one. Alan grew up 40 minutes from the city where I was raised. His father, Ray, had worked construction his whole life, framing, drywall, finish carpentry, whatever the job needed. His mother, Linda, had worked part-time at a grocery store and raised 3 kids and kept the household running with the kind of organized efficiency that doesn't get enough credit as a genuine skill. They were not wealthy. They were the kind of family that made things work, that fixed things instead of replacing them, that measured decisions carefully because the margin for error was smaller. Alan had gone to community college. He'd gotten his contractor's license at 22. He had started taking on small jobs himself, bathroom renovations, kitchen updates, the unglamorous but necessary work that homeowners need and don't always want to pay for. He'd built his reputation the slow way, job by job, through work that was done right and on time and within budget. By the time he was 25, he had a crew of 4. By the time I met him at 30, he had 8 employees and a waiting list. He had built everything he had from nothing, with his hands, through sustained daily effort over years. My father would not have found this impressive. My father found it vaguely embarrassing. Not because he had anything against work. Jerome Holloway had worked extremely hard his entire career. But there is a taxonomy in my father's mind, a hierarchy of legitimate effort, and manual labor, no matter how skilled, no matter how profitable, no matter how essential to the functioning of every single building my father had ever walked into, occupied a lower tier than work performed in a suit behind a desk. My father is a cardiologist. He went to good schools and kept going to them and emerged on the other side with the particular combination of competence and authority that certain professions confer. He is not a bad man. I have spent years trying to be honest about that, because the easier story is one with a clear villain, and he isn't that. He is a man with a very specific idea of what a life should look like and a limited ability to value things that fall outside that idea. My mother, Jenna, is a real estate attorney. She went to good schools too. She built a client list over 2 decades and maintained it through the kind of sustained professional socializing that looks effortless and is actually relentless work. She knows everyone. She knows what everyone's house is worth and what it says about them. She has opinions about neighborhoods the way other people have opinions about sports teams, passionate, tribal, occasionally irrational. They live in a house that has a name, not a street address only. A name, the kind that gets put on a stone pillar at the end of the driveway, the kind that signals a certain category of arrival. The garden is maintained by someone they pay. The wine is chosen by someone whose opinion they trust. The china is only for occasions. Alan did not belong in that house. They decided this in the first 8 minutes of meeting him. I had called the dinner casual. I want to be on record about this. I had described it to both Alan and my parents as casual. I believed, in the way that people believe things they want to be true, that this was a word with a shared meaning. My mother had set the good china. My father had opened a bottle that cost more than Alan's truck payment and watched with an expression he believed was neutral, as Alan didn't immediately perform recognition of the vintage. There was a moment, about 12 minutes in, where my father mentioned the vineyard and looked at Alan, and Alan said he wasn't much of a wine guy, but it tasted great, and something crossed my father's face that he immediately smoothed over. Alan was himself throughout dinner, completely, uncomplicatedly himself. He told a story about a renovation that had gone sideways in a way that was genuinely funny, the kind of story that requires good comedic timing and the willingness to make yourself the fool, and I laughed so hard I had to put my fork down. My mother smiled with the part of her face that isn't her eyes. My father asked a question about the renovation that sounded like interest but had the quality of a test. Alan answered it directly. He had good answers. He had spent 10 years learning things most people don't bother to learn, practical things, structural things, the things that determine whether a building stands or doesn't. He knew what he was talking about, and it showed, and my father could not quite figure out how to receive that. And so he went quiet in the particular way he goes quiet when something doesn't fit his framework. On the drive home, Alan said, "Your parents don't like me." I said, "They just need time." He looked at me briefly at a red light. He didn't say anything. He had better instincts than I did, and he knew it wasn't kindness to argue with me before I was ready to hear it. The conversation started the following week. My mother called first. She said she was concerned. She used phrases like long-term compatibility and shared backgrounds and the kind of life you were raised to expect. She said Alan seemed like a genuinely nice person, and she paused after genuinely the way you pause when a word is doing extra work. I said, "I appreciate your concern." She said, "We just want what's best for you, Catherine." I said, "I know." I didn't say, "What's best for me is not your call." I thought it. I stored it. My father called 2 days after that. He was, as always, more direct. He said he had dedicated his career to building a certain kind of life for himself and for our family, and he hoped I would make choices that reflected that investment. He said it without apparent awareness of how transactional it sounded, as though love were an investment vehicle and I owed him a return. I told them both the same thing. I was in love with Alan. I was going to keep seeing him. I hoped they would come to understand that. They did not come to understand it. They tried other things first. Over the next 2 years, my mother staged what I can only describe as a sustained campaign. Every family event produced a man, a colleague's son, a partner's nephew, someone named Bradley, who wore boat shoes at the table and said the word portfolio the way some people say weather, as though it were a fact about the world rather than a preference. My mother orchestrated seating arrangements with the precision of a military planner. She was not subtle. She had never particularly valued subtlety when directness was available. Alan found it funny, which is one of the things I love about him. He never felt threatened by it. He understood exactly what was happening, and he thought it was absurd, and he told me so gently, which allowed me to laugh about it instead of carrying it. What I carried instead was the low-grade exhaustion of navigating two worlds that didn't know how to speak to each other. Every visit home had a layer of effort to it, a kind of translation work I was always doing in both directions. I was explaining Alan to my parents in a language they were willing to receive, which was harder than it sounds. And I was managing my own grief, quietly, at the growing distance between who I was and who they wanted me to be. When Alan proposed, he did it in our apartment, Tuesday evening. He had come home from a job and I was making dinner, and he got down on one knee in the kitchen with a ring he'd had custom made. He had listened over months to the things I'd mentioned offhandedly about jewelry I liked, and he had taken those fragments and built something from them the way he built everything. I said yes before he finished asking the question. We told my parents the following Sunday. Dining room table, good chairs. My mother cried. I had hoped for a moment that these were the good kind of tears. They were not. They were the kind of tears that come from a specific mixture of anger and the frustration of not being able to say the anger out loud. My father set down his fork, which in our household is a gesture with weight. He said, "We've talked about this, Catherine. We've shared our concerns. And we want you to know that if you make this choice, we will be stepping back." He said, stepping back 4 times during that conversation. 4 times. I counted. I asked him what stepping back meant. He said, "We won't be at the wedding. We won't be present in your life the way we have been. And the arrangements we had planned, going forward, those will need to be reconsidered." He didn't say the word inheritance. He said arrangements. He said reconsidered. He was very careful with the words he chose to have on record. I knew what he meant. I had known for a while that there was a will and that I was in it, and that my grandfather's estate had seeded a level of family wealth that I had never had to think about directly, but had always known was there. The way you know certain things, not by looking directly at them, but by the light they cast. My father was telling me that Alan would cost me that light. I looked at him across the table. I looked at my mother, whose tears had dried into a careful expression, and I felt something shift in me, not dramatically, not like a break, more like a door closing softly all the way. I said, "Okay." I thanked my mother for dinner. Alan and I drove home. I told him everything, every word, and he held my hand in the car and didn't speak until I was finished. And then he said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. That's all. Whatever you decide." We got married on a Saturday in September. 43 people. My Aunt Barbara, my mother's sister, who had told me quietly that she thought my parents were making a mistake and that she would be there regardless. My friends from work, from college, from various chapters of my life. Alan's entire family, his parents, his 2 brothers, a constellation of cousins and aunts and family friends who arrived loud and warm and filled every corner of the room with something that felt, without trying to feel like anything, like belonging. His mother, Linda, cried the moment she saw me in my dress, real tears, the kind you can't manufacture. She held my face in her hands and said, "We are so happy you're ours now. My parents were not there. I will not pretend that didn't leave a mark. It did." There is a specific kind of grief that comes from an absence that could have been a presence. And I carried it through that day in the particular way you carry things on the best days, not letting it be the thing the day was about, but not pretending it wasn't there either. We built a life. Alan's business kept growing. He took on larger commercial projects, brought on more skilled tradespeople, developed a reputation for historic renovation work that put him in a different category than where he'd started. I built my marketing career and got good at it and moved into a role I hadn't expected to be ready for as quickly as I was. We bought a house, a Victorian that needed everything, which was, for Alan, not a problem but a pleasure. He worked on it for 2 years, evenings and weekends, doing things himself that a different person would have contracted out. I learned the difference between plaster and drywall. I learned to love the smell of sawdust. We got a dog named Franklin, a rescue mutt with a crooked ear and a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of routine. We planted a garden. Alan built the raised beds himself, obviously, out of cedar that he jointed and finished like they were going in a house rather than in the backyard. The garden produced more tomatoes than 2 people could reasonably eat, which led to the discovery that I was apparently someone who canned things now, which was not a version of myself I had anticipated. I made friends I kept. I had work I was genuinely proud of. I had a house that felt like ours in the specific way that things feel like yours when you've put work into them, when the decisions that shaped them were your decisions, when you can point at a wall and say, "Alan did that," and mean it the way you mean it when something matters. My life was not the one my parents had written for me. It was better. not in spite of the choices I'd made because of them. My parents existed at the perimeter. My mother sent birthday texts short, correctly spelled, requiring nothing from either of us. My father did not text. At Christmas, there was nothing. At Thanksgiving, there was nothing. My Aunt Barbara kept me loosely informed. My mother had redecorated the living room. My father had joined a golf club. There had been a trip somewhere in the spring. For 7 years, this was the shape of things. And then my mother called. She said she and my father had been thinking about family. She said they were hoping we could reconnect. She asked how I was. She did not ask about Alan. She did not say his name. I said I would think about it. I called Barbara. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means she is deciding how much to say. She said, "Catherine, there are some things you should probably know. My parents were in financial difficulty." She was careful about how she described it. She didn't have the full picture, but she had pieces. My father had left his practice not exactly on his own timeline, she said. There had been some kind of disagreement with the other partners, something about billing and administrative decisions, and the resolution had involved his departure earlier than anyone had publicly planned. He had framed it as retirement. Barbara thought that was partly true and partly not. My mother had lost 2 major clients in the same year. It had been harder to recover from than she'd let on. Her caseload was a fraction of what it had been, and the house, the one with the name, the one with the stone pillar, had an equity line against it. More than one, Barbara thought. I thanked her. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Then I agreed to dinner, not because I had decided anything, because I wanted to see it for myself. The house looked the same from the outside, gardens edged, driveway clear, the name on the stone pillar unchanged, inside, the good china out. My mother had cooked herself, which she had not done the first time Alan came to dinner, which told me something about where the budget currently was. My father looked tired, not old, just tired in a specific way. The way people look when they have been managing something difficult for a while and the management has become its own kind of exhaustion. We talked about surface things for a while. My mother asked about my work. I told her. She nodded in the way she nods when she is listening but waiting for her turn. My father asked about the house. I said we were happy there. He said, "Good." Just good. Then my father set his fork down. He said they had been reflecting on the future. He said they were hoping at this point in their lives that family could come together. He said the word family in the way people say it when they want the word to absorb more meaning than it can hold. He named the number, what they were hoping I could provide. I looked at him. I said, "What happened?" He said, "We've had some setbacks." I said, "What kind?" He looked at my mother. She looked at the tablecloth. I said, "I'm asking because I'd like to understand, not because I'm looking for a reason to say no. I just want to know what actually happened." He said, "Some of the investments didn't perform the way we'd anticipated. The practice situation was complicated. These things happen." I said, "Okay, I need some time to think." My mother said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." She walked me to the door when I left. She said, "We've missed you, Catherine." I said, "I know, Mom." I drove home and I told Alan everything. Every detail, every word, the way my father's face looked when I asked what happened and the way my mother's did not. Alan listened all the way through. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to understand what actually happened before I do anything." He said, "Then let's find out." My aunt filled in more pieces over the following days. My father's departure from the practice had been less mutual than described. There had been questions about billing, not fraud, nothing criminal, but practices that the other partners had objected to and that had ultimately forced a settlement and a separation. My mother knew. But she had her own version of the story, the one where it was largely the partner's fault, the one she had been telling long enough that she might have believed it herself. The investment losses were real and they were significant. My father had managed their portfolio personally for years, dismissing the idea of a financial advisor with the confidence of a man who trusted his own research over other people's expertise. He had made concentrated bets, not gambling exactly, but the investing equivalent of certainty applied where uncertainty was warranted, and several of them had failed. The losses had accelerated in the years before his retirement, which meant he had retired into a hole rather than out of one. I hired a financial consultant, a woman my own attorney knew, someone who was good at taking scattered information and constructing a coherent picture from it. I gave her what I had. I asked her to tell me what she saw. She came back with a number and a detail. The number was how much had been spent above income over the past 5 years, not counting normal living expenses, not counting the investment losses. It was a large number. It was a number that represented decisions made across years, borrowing against the house, spending down reserves, managing a gap that kept growing. The detail was about Derek. My brother is 4 years older than me. He is the kind of person who has tremendous energy for starting things and a genuine difficulty sustaining them past the point where the starting becomes maintaining. He had launched 3 businesses over 10 years. A tech thing early on that ran for 18 months before collapsing. He described it to my parents as a pivot, to my aunt as a learning experience, to me in a voicemail I never returned as a temporary setback. A restaurant concept that never made it past the planning stage but absorbed a year of effort and, I now understood, a significant amount of money. A consulting firm that had existed primarily on paper and on Derek's LinkedIn profile. I had known in the loose, unfocused way that you know things about family members you're not close to, that my parents helped Derek. I had not known the shape of it. I had not known the sustained, repeated, undeterred nature of it, the way they had absorbed each collapse and then looked at the next version of Derek's optimism and found a way to believe it again. I want to say that I think they loved him. I know they did. And I think when you love someone who keeps failing, the hardest thing to do is stop funding the failure, because stopping feels like abandonment and continuing feels like support. I understand that logic. I have compassion for it. But here is the other thing. Here is the thing I had to sit with. Each of these had been supported, at least partially, by our parents. Barbara had known this vaguely. The full amount she hadn't known, $82,000. Documented across 6 years in transfers and payments and co-signed obligations that had now expired and left no asset behind. While my parents were telling me that my choice of husband had cost me my inheritance, they were writing checks to Derek. I tried to do the math on what the inheritance might have been. In a world where it hadn't been spent down in multiple directions, I couldn't fully reconstruct it. Too many variables. But the number the consultant arrived at, the gap between what should have been there and what actually was large enough to make the conversation at the dining room table 7 years ago feel retroactively hollow. They had put a condition on my inheritance and spent the inheritance on the child who hadn't required conditions. Derek, who had not been presented with conditions. Derek, whose choices had never been evaluated for long-term compatibility or shared background. Derek, who had been given money for projects that failed, and then more money, and then more, without any of the language my parents had used with me about investment and judgment and the life they had raised me to expect. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it for several evenings, honestly, because I wanted to be fair. I wanted to not arrive at conclusions shaped by resentment rather than by what was actually true. But here is what I kept arriving at. The condition had never been about judgment. It had never really been about Alan. It had been about control. They had a version of my life they wanted, and when I declined it, they used the language of investment and wisdom to frame a punishment as a principle. And while they were articulating this principle to me, they were making the exact opposite decision for my brother, funding him unconditionally, repeatedly, past every point where a genuine concern about judgment would have said enough. The money was not the point. It had never been the point. The point was that I had left the story they had written for me, and they had needed a way to make that cost something. I called my mother back on a Sunday afternoon. I told her I had been thinking carefully. She said, "We're so glad, Catherine." We were hoping. I said, "I've done some research." She went quiet. I said, "I know about the consulting. I know about the practice. I know about the equity line on the house, and I know about Derek." The quiet on the other end had a different quality now. I said, "I'm not calling to make you feel bad about any of it. But I think you understand why I needed to know the actual situation before I responded to your request." My mother said slowly, "We didn't think of it as a request." I said, "What did you think of it as?" She didn't answer. I said, "Mom, I'm going to tell you what I've decided. Not because I'm angry, though I want to be honest that I have been, but because I think you deserve a direct answer." I said, "I'm not going to help financially, not because I can't, and not because I don't care what happens to you, but because I don't think a check would change anything. I think it would just delay the decisions you actually need to make." She started to say something. I said, "I'm not finished." She stopped. I said, "There is something I do want. I want a real relationship, not birthday texts, not the version where you call when you need something and disappear when you don't. A real one." I said, "But you need to understand what a real relationship with me looks like. It includes Alan. It has always included Alan. He is my family, and he has been for 7 years, and that is not something I'm willing to negotiate. If you want to be part of my life, he's part of that. That's not a condition. It's just how it is." I said, "When you're ready for that, I'm here." My mother was quiet for a long time. She said, "Can I think about it?" I said, "Of course." I hung up and sat in my kitchen with Franklin on my feet and the light coming through the window the way it does in the late afternoon, the warm, low light that Alan told me years ago is why you want to get the undertone right. I didn't feel victorious. I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to tired and something closer to sad and something that was also underneath those, a kind of relief. The particular relief of having said the true thing, finally, all the way. My father called 6 days later, not my mother. My father. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said to your mother." I said, "Okay." He said, "I think you're right that we made mistakes." I didn't say anything. I let that sentence be what it was. He said, "I'm not asking you to pretend any of it didn't happen. I know that's not how this works. I'm asking if there's a way to begin somewhere. Somewhere that isn't where we are." I said, "What does somewhere look like to you?" He said, "A phone call, regular, if you're willing to try it." I thought about it for a moment. A real moment, not a performed one. I said, "Bring Alan." He said, "I beg your pardon?" I said, "If you want to call with me, Alan is on the call. You can talk to him. You can hear his voice, and he can hear yours, and we can all be in the same conversation." That's what I mean by beginning somewhere, silence. Then my father said, "Okay." The first call was on a Tuesday evening, all 4 of us. My mother was quieter than usual, which meant she was paying attention. My father asked Alan about the business. not with the polite and slightly pointed formality of that first dinner, but with something that was at least reaching toward genuine curiosity. He asked about the commercial renovation work. He asked about historic buildings, specifically how you determine what's structurally original versus what's been modified over decades. Alan answered directly, without any performance of deference or warmth he didn't actually feel. He explained load-bearing assessment. He talked about the building they were working on downtown, a 1920s commercial block where a previous contractor had removed a wall incorrectly and the ceiling had been compromising for 30 years without anyone realizing it. He said, the scary part is not knowing what you're dealing with until you open the walls. My father said, that sounds like surgery. Alan considered this. He said, yeah, actually, same principle. You don't always know until you're in there, and sometimes what you find changes the plan completely. My father said, and then how do you account for that in the bid? And Alan explained. He talked about contingency structures, about how you price for what you know and you protect yourself and the client for what you might find, about the difference between a client who understands that uncertainty is part of historic work and one who doesn't, and how you figure out which kind you're dealing with in the first conversation. My father listened. Actually listened, not with the performance of listening he sometimes used when he was waiting for his turn to speak. At one point, he asked a follow-up question that showed he had retained something Alan said 3 minutes earlier. I watched this from my end of the call and did not say anything. I just let it be what it was. After we hung up, Alan sat with his coffee for a minute and then said, your dad is sharper than he lets on in person. I said, what do you mean? He said, in person, he was performing. Tonight, he was just thinking. Different person. I thought about that. I thought about all the ways my father had been performing for as long as I could remember: the wine, the table, the careful word choices, the house with the name, and about what was underneath the performance and whether there was something genuine there that had simply never been given space. I didn't know. I still don't entirely, but I thought about it. My parents sold the house, the one with the name. They moved into something smaller, something that didn't have equity borrowed against it, something they could maintain without the weight of a life size beyond what the finances currently supported. My mother picked up some clients again, slower going than she wanted, because the professional network thins when you step back from it, and she had stepped back further than she'd admitted. My father took on consulting work, reviewing cases, advising younger cardiologists, work that used what he knew without requiring the full infrastructure of a practice. I watched this happen from a distance, mostly through Barbara, and I want to be honest about what I felt watching it. Part of what I felt was something uncomfortably close to vindication, and I don't think that reflects well on me, and I'm including it here because this story isn't about making myself the uncomplicated hero. Part of what I felt was grief, real grief, for the version of my parents who might have made different choices, who might have arrived at a smaller and more honest life without needing the whole structure to collapse first. And part of what I felt was something I can only describe as relief that the pretense was over. The house with the name had always been, to me, a kind of performance. Living inside a performance is exhausting in ways you don't fully measure until you step outside it. They did not ask me for money again. Whether they found other solutions or simply restructured around what they had, I genuinely don't know. I chose not to investigate further. I had found what I needed to find to make my own decision, and beyond that, it was their life to manage. I don't know exactly what they asked Derek. I chose not to ask. Some questions I decided I didn't need the answers to, because the answers would just be more weight, and I was trying to put weight down, not pick more up. Derek and I have never been close. We are not close now. He exists in my life the way a chapter of a book exists. When you've already moved past it, you know it's there. You can return to it if you need the context, but you're not reading it anymore. What I know is this. 7 years ago, my parents made a choice. They looked at Alan and they looked at me and they made a calculation that the life they wanted for me was worth more than the life I was choosing, and that the way to prove this was to take something away. They were wrong about what I would do. And it turned out they were also wrong about what they had to take. The assets they'd held over my head had been spent on the versions of themselves they couldn't sustain, on the child who stayed in their story, on the compounding cost of managing a gap between how things were and how they wanted things to look. But here is the part that isn't simple. Here is the part I have to be honest about. They came back eventually, imperfectly. They came back. My father said the word mistake and applied it to himself and meant it. That is harder than it sounds. I have watched people go their entire lives without doing that, and I know what it costs, and I choose to count it as something. We are not the family we might have been. We don't have holidays together, not yet. That feels like a bridge too far, too much performance required from everyone, too much pretending the table has always looked this way, but we have the calls. Once a month, sometimes more, Alan and my father talk about buildings. My mother asks me about work and listens when I answer. Once, my mother asked Alan what he thought about a home improvement question she was dealing with, and Alan answered her practically and without any shadow of the past in his voice, because that's who he is. He doesn't carry things he doesn't need to carry. I asked him once if he resented them for the years, for the wedding they didn't come to, for the way my father had looked at him at that first dinner as though he were a problem to be solved. Alan thought about it for a while. He took a sip of his coffee. He looked out at the garden. He said, "I think they loved you the best way they could, and their best way was pretty narrow. That's sad for them more than it's anything I need to be angry about." I thought about that for a long time. He's right. He almost always is. It's one of the things that used to make me defensive early on and now just makes me grateful. My name is Catherine Holloway. I married the wrong man, according to two people who had very specific ideas about what wrong and right looked like and what kind of life was worth building and what kind of person was worth building it with. Alan helped me pick paint in a hardware store 17 years ago. He renovated our house with his own hands. He has held my hand in every difficult car ride home, including the ones I didn't tell him were difficult until we were already in the driveway. He was on a call with my father and asked a follow-up question about load-bearing walls because he was genuinely interested, not because he was performing interest, not because he was trying to win anything. He was just himself. He has always been just himself. It turns out that is the only quality that matters in the long run, and it is much rarer than people admit. I got everything I needed. It just didn't look like anything my parents had planned for me. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done differently. Fireside Stories. New episodes 3 to 4 times each week. I'll see you at the next one.